Well, hello and thank you for joining me for another Alex on Tech and ITY video. I'm joined today by, on my left, Peter Price, the CEO of Crime Stoppers, and on my right, Peter Coroneos, the former head of the Internet Industry Association and the current International Vice President of CIAN, the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
G'day, Alex.
Now, both of you are going to talk about your history in the world of the internet and some of your recollections, so I'm going to let you guys go for it.
All right, well, Peter and I go back a ways, don't we?
We do.
I guess cybercrime, cybersecurity has been a bit of a common thread in our respective careers. Probably you more than me, although I guess thinking back to the early days, it was something we'd identified pretty early. And at one point, you were on the board of the Internet Industry Association.
Yeah, it was a great privilege to actually be on the board of the IA and served on that board for, I think, 3 or 4 years. It was definitely an interesting space to be in, and of course the internet has changed exponentially in the last 10 years, never mind the last 30 years. And of course, you know, the internet being what it is, it's kind of like the new Wild West. It's where the gold rush is, and there's obviously a lot of cowboys basically riding on horseback in that Wild West area. And our job is to see if we can tame them. Not an easy task, but you know, if you don't start somewhere, you'll never finish.
And just quickly, I mean, the internet was looked upon as the Wild West, and here we are 30 years later celebrating the 30th anniversary of the internet in Australia, and nothing has changed in that sense. It's become more of a cat and mouse, cowboys and Indians type of game.
It's phenomenal, yeah. I was going through, I've got a lot of archive documents that I've kept. Thankfully, I think I did the right thing and kept them all. And going through last night, actually, just in preparation for this big gala dinner that we're doing, I was just astonished. Document after document I was pulling up out of all different areas, and the issues are still current. There are issues around copyright, issues around ISP filtering, issues around child protection,
Encryption,
cybercrime. So I guess, you know, if they'd asked us 20 years ago if we thought a lot of these issues would have been resolved by now, I would have said, well, hopefully yes. Almost resoundingly yes, but you know, we look at it now and very little has changed.
I think the interesting thing is, you know, like with the iCode, which the IA was the first in the world to actually create such an instrument, sharing that with the rest of the world has obviously been a huge opportunity for Australia, obviously, and obviously, you know, to raise that flag. And Pete and I were lucky enough to go and talk about the iCode at the White House in Washington DC, and that was an interesting experience. You know, I remember specifically sitting in that room with some of the major telcos from the US. And even then we were talking about the fact that the internet or the World Wide Web was this kind of Wild West. It was like a broken scenario. And even then they were saying, well, what do we do to fix it? And I remember thinking, and Pete, you might be able to correct me here, but I remember thinking, I'm not sure if I said it, but I said to the guys from the US, I'm sure that 40 or 50 years ago, you put a man on the moon, and if you managed to do that 40 years ago, you must be able to fix the World Wide Web, which you created in the first place.
Right.
And it just kind of seems that, you know, and I'm not sure if we'll ever fix the World Wide Web. You know, when you think about, you know, various things like, you know, that are traded on the internet, whether it's human trafficking or things like that, you know, in an offline environment, there are still plenty of crimes that have been going on since forever and a day. So it's unlikely, in my view, that the internet will suddenly become devoid of crime. You know, it'll never become this pure white landscape.
it mirrors the real world, and of course on the internet we have the dark web with the Tor browser and all the crazy things that happen there, which didn't exist probably at the time, but are now worse than ever.
Criminals are getting better, getting smarter, more empowered by the technology. I mean, going back to the White House visit, there was a bit of history there that Howard Schmidt, who was Obama's advisor, the presidential advisor on cybersecurity, had formerly been the CSO of Microsoft, Chief Security Officer, and that's where I'd first met him back in the mid-2000s, I guess, the first decade. And we've been developing the iCode here in Australia based on some earlier work, the pilot study that came through ACMA and the Australian Internet Security Initiative with Bruce Matthews as its champion. And we'd been approached by the government in about 2008-9 to see whether we'd be prepared to take it on board and turn it into an industry-wide code of practice. And initially I was a bit hesitant because we were then in a little bit of a conflict with the copyright industry, and you'll remember the famous iiNet case. And so the concern really was that we were going to create a precedent by not so much monitoring, but by using technology to track certain behaviours on the internet, in this case zombied computers, which were a huge problem and still are. The concern was that we were going to create a precedent for ourselves that it might be extended into other areas. So I basically insisted on a guarantee from the government at the time that that wasn't going to be the case. They made it clear that they really wanted us to do this. And subsequently it was launched in Australia. We had 92% of the Australian user base covered within 6 months. Voluntary scheme, no legislation. Fantastic. Coming together, there was a lot of stakeholder management to pull that together. We had consumer groups, law enforcement, defence, telco sector. But then what happened was that our government wanted to champion the initiative through 5i's. And it was there that Howard picked up on the fact that this work had been happening. And so I get a call from Washington to say, would you come to the White House and tell me about how you managed to do this, because we'd like to do something similar. And I said, sure. So I was due to go to the States anyway, and hooked up with Howard, and it was just pretty much a one-on-one with his advisor, and we were just talking about the stakeholder management piece actually, which was a significant part that had to be managed. Anyway, in the subsequent trip, and this is where Peter came along, and we were invited in again to the executive offices, but it all turned out to be a bit of a setup, because also in the room was the, policy heads from AT&T, Sprint, Verizon, Time Warner, Cox, Comcast. These were technical guys and policy people. And Howard basically stood me up and said, okay, tell these people what you did in Australia and how you got industry behind you. You remember this conversation?
Absolutely.
And I'm there thinking, wait, this isn't going to end well. And then he turned to them after the presentation and he said, well, you've heard from the Aussies, now what's wrong with you people?
Exactly, yeah. It was like we were punching way above our weight, weren't we, at that stage?
Unbelievable. It was pretty surreal, but really the outcome of that was he basically gave an ultimatum to them. He said, either you go away and do something similar, or we're going to regulate you.
And this was which president?
Under Obama.
Under Obama, yeah.
So Pete, it's been a while since you and I caught up, and we haven't discussed much since that time in Washington DC. But so since then, some of those people have moved on, some have actually passed on. But what's been the uptake?
Well, this is what I was going to say, because we only caught up with for lunch last week, and we haven't seen each other for 8 years. And where we left off at the White House was, you went and did other stuff, and I ended with the AAA. But then what happened was the US telcos did go away and they did write a code, and it was substantially based on the work that we'd done here, almost verbatim. There are large tracks that were a straight lift. And you really didn't know about that. And I said, well, did you know that in the end they came together and they launched this with the approval of the FCC under Julian Grenichowski, the chair. It was a big public announcement. They lined up about 12 or 20 companies. There was a significant number. And I calculated there would have been about 100 million Americans that were brought in under that scheme. If you add up what their relative share of the broadband market was at the time, it was a very significant number of people.
And does that code stand to this day, both in Australia and the US?
Well, it's probably iterated into other forms now, but the original thinking, and let me explain what it did, because I think a lot of people wouldn't even be aware. What it was ACMA had pioneered or had licensed a forensic tool where you could scan networks for signs of compromised computers. And they exhibit weird things, like they might wake up in the middle of the night and send a whole lot of spam.
Yeah, I mean, botnets are still a huge problem today.
Exactly. And so the issue was that the users didn't know that they'd been zombied. And this iCode was designed to basically, firstly, inform the ISP that there was an issue on their network if they didn't know already. And a lot of them did know, but some of them didn't. And then we had to create a protocol where the end user would be informed and offered assistance. So we didn't just leave them out in the cold, we had to give them a remediation plan. And there was even a company in Australia called Gizmo that was running around doing house calls for people that didn't know how to fix their computers.
Yeah, I mean, these days you see your Chrome browser popping up with a warning from Google that this site might be infected or that there's strange activity happening. So I guess it evolved in that particular sense. But that was a very important thing because people had no idea.
No, and then the South Africans approached me, your home country, your countrymen, and
as long as there's no sandpaper involved.
And I knew we had an affiliation with the South African Industry Association, and I'd been over there a few times to speak at their conferences. And one year they said, "Well, tell us about this iCode, you know," and I can't do the accent, but you know. So the thing was, they were saying, you know, we're getting some inquiries from our government. Would we be prepared to do something similar? So we ended up doing a pilot program in South Africa as well. And I'd left by then, so I don't know what happened after that, but certainly there was an influence around promulgating this idea that despite our long-held reservations around intermediaries not being responsible for everything that happens on their network, and that's still a very live issue, we felt that with cybersecurity there was a point of difference where you're actually trying to sanitize a network for the good of the users and for the good of the internet. So the aim was to really, it was an empowerment strategy ultimately. It wasn't a punitive strategy, although there were some sanctions there for ultimate cases where people were not taking the advice and helping themselves, and so there was ways that we would assist them, quarantine them in a walled garden until they could pay attention. But there was these issues of taking people off the internet was never true, and unfortunately some of that sort of got out there. But yeah, there was a lot of media management because it's a pretty scary thing, this idea of someone surveilling a network, and I think still very pertinent issue today.
But I think the consumers have become much more aware about things that go on online, obviously through various media commentators and things like that. But you know, at the end of the day, you know, our sort of mandate is to increase awareness around how to basically what we call practice safe hygiene online. And you know, talking to consumers, and consumers are consumers at home, but they're business people during the day. And somehow, you know, you can go to work during the day and you can practice a certain amount of technology hygiene, but when you go home, the sort of gloves come off and you kind of forget about it all.
Right.
And you know, teaching people how to, you know, teach their kids, etc., pass it on from generation to generation. So I think, you know, between sort of the iCode being like a business tool and then us on this side basically speaking to the consumers through education, you know, organisations like ACMA, organisations like the government of the E-Safety Commissioner, you know, collectively we all play a massive role in collaborating to make the internet a safer place. And I guess it's a bit like, you know, if you look outside on the street and you look at traffic, you know, if we never had lane markings for traffic, we never had traffic lights, and we never had order, then it would just be basically the best word I can find is chaos, you know. And so you need to create order in this environment where there's a lot of lawlessness.
And there's a lot of traffic chaos in countries that don't have the same sort of you know, ordered traffic system that we have in the West. You know, we hear about crazy accidents in Bali, and we've seen the pictures of crazy traffic in India and other places, and you know, it's just one of those things where law and order makes a big difference.
Yet, having said all that, in our hearts as internet pioneers, you know, policy pioneers at least, there's still a very strong sense of the open nature and the free nature of the internet has to be preserved. And I think the challenge, and this is why these policy discussions were so complex but also so interesting, is how to get
still
the
relevant
balance
today.
Where's the balance? How you could lock it down so much that you know, everything's white lists and permission based, and that you'd have, you know, much less crime. but you'd probably kill the spirit and the innovation and the creativity along with it.
It's almost like you could reach a point of tyranny,
Right?
but you need to let democracy actually flourish.
Yeah.
Because it's democracy that actually, basically is the essence of our community,
Of our society.
of our
Yeah.
society.
Yeah, and so that's the key, and that's why we were concerned that iCode shouldn't become a precedent. And I have to throw in one other thing. So Alistair McGibbon has agreed to come and speak on the night, which will be fantastic, and he'll give the cyber perspective. But there's also going to be another guy called Michael Malone that will be coming along, and we're going to be talking about the copyright issues. And there is a nexus there. There is a connection in the federal court case of iiNet, and we'll talk about this in another interview, maybe with Michael. The counsel for the 34 Hollywood studios held up a copy of our iCode, and he said, you can do it for security, but you're not prepared to do it for copyright. And so all my concerns that, that this could be a precedent actually materialised right then and there on the spot. Thankfully, the judge, I don't think they gave too much weight to that. But it just goes to show that any work that you do in any area can be either used or misused, can be applied or misapplied. And that's where we need clear judgment and, I guess, the wisdom of experience.
I mean, it's interesting, when you look at Australia, 25 million people, and you think about the impact that the iCode has actually had across the world. And I think, there's something about smaller countries basically having this need to pioneer, this need to prove themselves. I mean, there's so many things that have come out of New Zealand, for example, so many things that have come out of Israel. Tiny countries, look, we're essentially a tiny country, big landmass, but a small country. And I think it's great to actually see that. I mean, in terms of, from the Crime Stoppers perspective, whilst we operate in 26 countries around the world, Australia was the first country in the world to provide fully encrypted online reporting. It led the way in that for literally like a decade. So I think there's something in our DNA around basically proving to the rest of the world that we actually are a source of good ideas. And I mean, look at the creativity that comes out of New Zealand with films and things like that. It's just incredible, just outstanding.
I think part of it's our isolation, and also in the case of the internet policy pioneering work that was happening here, it was largely a product of our legislative system and a very small, tightly knit industry. And you get a coalescence of those factors. Could talk about this at length, but there is something quite unique about the Australian policy environment, which means that it's both an imperative but also an opportunity to do some really innovative thinking around how you balance the freedoms with security. And I think that work will go on.
As they say, necessity is the mother of invention. Right. And when you've got the tyranny of distance to overcome and all the rest, those things come into play. Peter Price, do you have any memories of the internet over the past 30 years that really stand out for you?
Look, I think the thing that I always think about now, even just before this meeting, I was looking up some stuff on my phone, and I'm just amazed how quickly we can access information. I mean, I just walked 4 blocks across town, and I needed to find out something, so I just talked into my phone and said, "Hey Siri, can you find me this?" And within 15 seconds, I had the information, and it's absolutely marvelous. It's just brilliant. I mean, I just wonder. We've got 5G coming, and what's going to come after that? And we are living in the most exciting time in humankind right now. It's just incredible.
I agree. So we'll be touching on some of these big issues, the visions of the future at our event, the 30th anniversary of the internet in Australia on the 31st of October. I really hope that the people watching this will come along and support the event. This is an amazing milestone that really needs to be recognised. And I think although time will be short, we won't be able to go into the depth that we've gone into today, but there are so many different areas that need to be acknowledged and so many people to be thanked. So thank you, Alex, for videoing this session, and
you're welcome.
To see everyone there.
For everybody watching, please go to 30igala.com.au to learn more, to get tickets, look at sponsorship. And Peter Price, thank you very much for your time as well.
Thanks.
Thank you, Peter.
See you again.
Thank you.